the entire nation is talking about bookkeeping,
Accounting,
and bookkeeping. The entire
invoices,
nation.
journal
Invoices,
entries, general ledgers.
checks. I'll share my screen here.
It's all thanks to Donald Trump and the guilty verdict in New York State. David, it's funny. I was looking at the New York Times front page yesterday, and I was thinking, how are we going to talk about this on the show in a way that isn't just a rehash of everything else that people are hearing about the Trump case? Yeah. And the New York Times just put it right in front of me. They had a breakdown of the 34 charges and the guilty verdicts for each. And as you're displaying on the screen right now, they are all related to invoices, general ledger details, and checks.
And each one of these are accounts. So if I created an invoice that was fake, that's account. And then it recorded to the general ledger, that's account. And then if I paid that invoice with a check, that's account.
So three felonies for every payment.
Yeah. So in summary, you had a total of 34, 11 for invoices, 12 for ledger entries, and 11 for checks. That's how you get your 34.
Interesting how there's like it's not exactly the same number, right? You would think there's an invoice, there's a ledger entry, and there's a check for every payment. I'm curious about that. But that's not the big story. The big story, of course, is what exactly happened here. So, David, why don't you read one of these counts? It's fascinating. I haven't dug into this case really until now because I just always figured that Trump would get off like he always does, right? Like everything seems to slide off of him, but not this time. So, pick one of these. Which one should we read?
We will read this one. This is count number 4. It's a check. It says the defendant in the county of New York or elsewhere on or about February 14th of 2017 with the intent to defraud and the intent to commit another crime and aid and conceal the commission thereof made and caused a false entry to business records of an enterprise, to wit, Donald J. Trump, revocable trust account, check, and check stub dated February 14th, 2017, bearing check number 000138 and kept and maintained by the Trump Organization. So there a lot of these charges, and when you look at these, they're basically saying this transaction was recorded in the bookkeeping of the Trump revocable trust in the Trump Organization.
Right.
Over and over again.
Every one of the 34 charges is related to falsifying business records, which is normally a misdemeanor. It's a misdemeanor in New York State to falsify a business record, but it becomes a felony when it's done in association with, in connection with another crime. And that's where this all gets very interesting. And this is why I thought that Alvin Bragg wasn't going to be able to get a guilty verdict, because not only does he have to prove the falsifying of business records, which is actually pretty easy to do, I think. All right, you look at them, right? That's not what it was for, yeah. Right? It was not a legal retainer to Michael Cohen. It was a hush money payment, and that's pretty obvious when you look at the paper trail. But that's just a misdemeanor. So what made it a felony, according to this verdict, is that it was in connection with campaign finance violations. So the jury had to agree with the prosecutor that the payment to Stormy Daniels was made to influence the election, and therefore it should have come from campaign funds, right? It's basically it was a donation by Michael Cohen or Trump or whatever to the campaign in excess of the amount you're allowed to, because there's a limit on how much you can contribute as an individual to a campaign. So that's how they got this verdict.
Because the argument or the point of view, and I saw this in the Washington Examiner, the title of the article was "Who's the Victim of Trump's Bookkeeping?" And basically the argument is that, because you could look at these bookkeeping transactions and say, like, who's the victim? But the argument is the victims are the citizens of the United States, because this hush money payment may have affected the entire election that was so close.
Right.
By keeping that news about Trump out of the news cycle for the election.
Yeah.
And so how did they bridge that, I guess? That's the part I still can't. So it's not that he actually took campaign funds. They're saying these should have been allocated and recorded as campaign funds somewhere else because they actually affect the election.
The key issue is that the payments are effectively unlawful contributions to Trump's campaign because the payments were made to prevent voters from learning information that could have impacted the election outcome. And this is where I think Trump has the possibility to win on appeal, which is that it was Cohen's testimony and the testimony of who was the guy at the tabloid who testified against Trump? I forget the National Enquirer guy, right? So they testified that this was Trump's intent, that Trump wanted to suppress the information to influence the election. And so then that should have been paid by the campaign. So that's what made it illegal, right? That it was a campaign, unlawful contribution to the campaign. Because you don't
take the campaign out of it in the presidential race, and Trump just wants to cover up this information. If he would have done the same thing with his bookkeeping, it would just be misdemeanors.
Right. And there's nothing illegal about hush money payments. Yeah. That is not against the law. To suppress information by paying somebody to stay quiet is something that's done all the time. Very common, right? Payments to employees when they leave, a severance payment that includes a non-disparagement clause or a non-disclosure agreement. Those are all very, very, very common. So that's not illegal. And, you know, the argument I think that is the most persuasive on the Trump side is that, look, would he have made this payment even if he wasn't running for president? Right?
Yes.
He wouldn't want this coming out, no matter what. So there's that to consider, right? And then the other question I had is, what should have been the journal entry in the Trump Organization accounts for this payment, right? Like what was fraudulent about the way it was recorded? So it was recorded, I believe, in the general ledger of the Trump Organization as legal expenses. And there was even testimony on the stand by the controller that said, look, we just have one account for all of our legal expenses and it goes into legal expenses. And the joke you made, David, is that they might have just been using the default QuickBooks chart of accounts.
Yes.
Because there's only one account for legal expenses.
I think the prosecution, or they implied that the accounting system was so out of date because they only had one choice for legal expenses.
Right. So, I thought, well, why not go and use all this AI that we have now to our benefit and ask ChatGPT, what is the journal entry?
Before you ask that, though, I want some questions that I was having along the same lines about the transactions. And I was thinking, instead of creating an invoice and then writing a check, if you just would have wrote the checks, would he have 11 less counts? Because you would just be, you'd have a check in the general ledger and the check, and you'd have a less count. Then I was thinking, if he paid this from his personal bank account and not the trust or the business, would this be an issue at all? And then I'm thinking, if they would have just put it all the owner's draw, would that have been an issue? Or what if it was recorded as a political donation? So in my head, I'm like, how should this have been recorded? So I'm glad you kind of thinking the same way, right?
I want to know, how could this have been done legally? Or how could this have not been fraud in the Trump Organization books? So let's just ask ChatGPT, what is the journal entry for a hush money payment? Journal entries for hush money payments are generally not explicitly discussed in standard accounting practices. Okay, that's good. See, I didn't know this, and I didn't learn it in school, but that's okay, because normally it's not. So here's a detailed scenario. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see the detailed analysis that ChatGPT is doing. And the scenario is that a company makes a hush money payment of $10,000. The potential journal entry it suggests is a debit to miscellaneous expenses and a credit to cash. So maybe if the Trump Organization had just debited miscellaneous expenses instead of legal expenses, it wouldn't have been a problem. Consulting fees. I don't know. I'm not being serious about this, but I think there is a question as to what exactly this is the thing I find amazing.
Marketing expense. He could have put it to marketing.
But this is we've talked about this on the show before. This is what I find kind of strange about this whole thing, is that part of the reason the Trump Organization ended up in trouble about this is because they sought to cover it up. But as a private company, it's not like anybody's going in and expecting, these like, how would any of this have ever become public in the general ledger? So there wasn't really a need to cover this up with the general ledger system in the Trump Organization. Like you said, David, it would have been better if just like Trump had made the payment directly to Stormy Daniels, and the NDA, right, the hush money would have prevented her from ever speaking about the payment itself. And that's usually how it's done. Usually somebody just pays somebody to stay quiet, and it includes you don't say anything about the payment either. You can't talk about any of it.
And the interesting thing about this pattern we've seen with the Trump Organization and Trump bookkeepers, Trump's accountants, the CFO. Remember the CFO when he was paying like the private school or whatever, but he kept all meticulous records of it, right?
Right.
The same thing happened here. They were writing on bank statements. They kind of kept meticulous records of something that they wanted to keep hidden.
Yeah. The other crime here is that they were too detailed in their criminal record keeping, right? If you're going to do crime, don't keep track of it in a meticulous way. Yeah. David here in the live stream says, debit, ask my accountant. Credit, cash. Yes. See, that's a good one. Yeah. So if they had not kept the records like they did, if they had just made the payments and not tried to cover up the payments in the Trump Organization, then I'm not sure there would have been a case here. That's the crazy thing about it.
So then the jump, if he paid this out of his personal, it would still, the way their argument is, if he would have paid this out of his personal bank account, their argument is this is a political contribution to the campaign.
Or it should have been, yeah. And that's where I think this case is actually still on shaky ground and has a chance to lose on appeal or get overturned on appeal, which is, like, how do you prove that intent? In this case, it was proven through the testimony of Cohen and the National Enquirer guy, but we don't have any hard evidence that says this was Trump's intent. And he's said publicly, of course, that like he didn't want it to come. I think he said something about, he didn't want his family to know about it, right?
Yeah, his personal reputation.
Right, exactly. So there's plenty of motivations other than influencing the election for this. And I don't know if it was really proven other than through the testimony of a liar, Cohen, right? And a tabloid publisher that this was Trump's intent. Now, the jury believed it, and that's what matters in the end when it comes to a guilty verdict, is whether the jury believes it. The question, though, is going to be whether the Court of Appeals, thinks that's enough.
But I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a campaign funds expert, but I imagine that, let's say they paid it from the campaign funds. I can't imagine that would be legal either.
No, I think it is.
That's totally legal to do. Like, they could have just used the campaign funds and wrote a check.
I don't know. Like I said, I'm not, like you said, we're not lawyers here, but I've never heard of anything illegal about a campaign organization making a hush money payment.
Because they could just do them.
Because hush money payments are not illegal. How they get the money is
all the laws, right? How they get the money is really where all the laws are. What they spend it on, there's not a lot of laws or governance.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's if they had just paid directly. And that's where, like, I feel like people who support Trump have a legitimate point, which is like, okay, it's all about this seems to all be about the form of it, not what actually happened. If it had just been done in a different manner, it wouldn't be a felony. So it seems like that's the argument on the Trump side that I buy, that I find compelling, is this is all form, it's not substance.
Yeah.
Because hush money payments are not illegal.
Or just write one check, so there's just one count. like you open yourself up to a nightmare. Why
that's another thing
out
about
across
form.
11 checks. That's stupid.
Yeah. So, like you said, David, I don't know if you said this while we were recording or before. It's like there's a lot of dumb people that work for Donald Trump, and like this is my biggest problem with having him as our president. Is like what are these people doing? Like, how stupid can you be?